Good morning. Sorry for the delay. The outline has last class that we had before Passover. So we're starting at number 5, Moses meets Pharaoh. We already discussed how Moses was asked by God to be the messenger to... Can't hear me? Make the speaker louder. Hear me now?
Yeah.
We already discussed, first of all, good morning. And welcome back. Even though we celebrated Passover and we're free, we're still in exile, and we still have to focus on getting out of exile. So last class, we discussed how God chose Moses to be the leader, the liberator. Moses reluctantly accepted it after a week of arguing with God, which is, of course, a very powerful concept of people arguing with God. Imagine if God would come to any one of us and tell us to do something, who would say no? And Moses says, no, I'm sorry, with all due respect, I'm not the one qualified to be the liberator. And the last thing he says is, send someone else to do it. Why do you need me? And God tells him, don't worry, your brother Aaron, who Moses intimated is the one that God should have sent, will be very happy that you have been chosen. I don't know if I mentioned the last class, but that was a departure from all the dysfunctional siblings in the past in the Torah. Cain kills Abel, Noah's sons didn't get along, Abraham's 2 sons didn't get along, and Isaac's 2 sons didn't get along, and Jacob's 12 sons didn't get along. Brothers some had these squabbles, and sometimes it was more than a squabble, it was deathly. And here Moses is being chosen over his older brother Aaron, who was as qualified as Moses, you would think. And Aaron is not only not upset, he's rejoicing, he's celebrating. So finally Moses had no way to excuse himself from this mission, and he goes to Pharaoh. That's where we left off. How did Moses get into Pharaoh's palace?
Knocked on the door.
Knocked on the door. Here the Jews are mercilessly being enslaved, having no rights whatsoever, and all of a sudden Moses shows up and, I want to speak to Pharaoh. Do you have a prior appointment? No, I just like to see him. It's very important, I assure you. How did they allow Moses into the palace? So there are a lot of different midrashic answers to that question, and one of them is that when Moses tried to get into the palace, they were actually surrounded by guards, and the guards just fell apart. They didn't do anything. Then there were lions that were there to protect the king, and the lions acted like little pussycats, and they didn't do anything, and they followed him into Pharaoh. But there's a simpler explanation how Moses got in. Well, actually, it's not such a simple explanation, but you have to realize that Moses was a Levite, Moses and Aaron, who were not enslaved. They were an elite that never agreed to start working for Pharaoh when Pharaoh was paying them for the work. So Moses was a free person, but it's still a problem because Moses was sentenced to death for killing the Egyptian guard. Moses was a fugitive. Moses was a common criminal in the eyes of the Egyptians. And here he's marching in to speak to Pharaoh, and nobody does anything. So that's why the Midrash asserts that it was a miraculous entry. It was not normal. So this is just one of the many miracles, even if it's not described as such as a miracle, like the 10 plagues are, it is nevertheless a great miracle. Now, we all know that when Moses comes to Pharaoh, what does Moses say to Pharaoh? Everyone knows the slogan, "Let my people go." There's no such quote. There is such a quote, but it's only half of the quote. And that's a very major flaw in the way it's quoted. Whenever Moses demands, "Let my people go," he says, "so that they may serve me." The Jews were not liberated from Egypt to be free people with a godless people. They were only freed so they could become God's servants. And we discussed this many times, that a human being cannot be without a master. Every human being has a master. You could choose to have many masters, or you could choose to have one master with a capital M, and that's God. And that's the ultimate form of freedom, when you have the right master, because that unifies your whole life, it gives meaning to your whole life, and it expresses what your soul really wants to do. That's true freedom. So Moses doesn't just go to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go, free them, let my people go so that they may serve me," meaning referring to God, of course. And Moses brings in the staff with which he performs all these miracles. The Midrash says that this staff was not just a normal staff. The staff originally belonged to Adam. And when Adam passed it down to his descendants, it ended up, ultimately, I'm not going to go through the whole history, it ended up in the hands of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, yes?
It says, you just said about, and let my people go, and to me that's a Christian statement, because it says in the Torah, in Exodus 4, he says, "Let my firstborn son." That's a big statement. That means a lot more than "let my people go." Let my firstborn son. That's the first statement that God makes, that we're his children and we're a family. That's an important thing not to leave out.
Oh, we're definitely not going to leave it out. God is certainly telling the people, the Jewish people, telling Pharaoh that these are my firstborn children.
He's telling Moses that too.
And Moses is telling that to Pharaoh.
Right.
Okay, yes, but when Moses makes the initial request, he says, "Let my people go so that they may serve me." That's the point. And Moses' staff was a miraculous staff. It was passed down all the way from Adam, all the way down to, somehow it got into the hands of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who planted it in the earth, and nobody could pull it out. It was so entrenched there, no one can pull it out, until Moses came and he pulled it out. And that's how we got hold of this miraculous staff. And when Moses speaks to Pharaoh, Moses set the tone for how we deal with power. Moses was assertive. He makes demands. "Let my people go so that they may serve me." He tells him in no uncertain terms, "God sent me to tell you that this is what you have to do." That's pretty assertive in the presence of a monarch, of an emperor. But he's also he shows respect to Pharaoh. And we find that attitude later on in the Torah. Elijah, there was a king of Israel, Achav in Hebrew, and this Achav was a real wicked guy. And Eliyahu is very firm with him, but he also shows him respect. And that's how Jews throughout history behaved in relation to governments. We are firm when we speak to the government. You go to the president and you tell him in no uncertain terms what we demand of him, president, governor, mayor, whatever, but we do it with respect. We don't trash the person, because the government, there's a Talmudic expression, the government on earth is analogous, is like the government in heaven. that God created governments to have certain status that are reflections of a higher kind of leadership of government. And we treat it with respect, even as we're firm, and show that we're not just giving in to anything that this tyrant wants. And of course, you have to make sure that you don't get your head chopped off in the process. But you don't act with humility towards the king. You act with assertiveness. And that's what Moses demonstrates. And then Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, God of Israel sent me to tell you to let them go. And Pharaoh says, I don't know God. Pharaoh had a telephone directory of all the gods. And he looked up the Jewish God, and it wasn't there. He said, I don't know, I know many gods of all the different nations, but this God I don't know. But the deeper meaning of this was, God has two basic names, he has 7 basic names, but 2 of the most central. One is Elohim, which refers to God as he's vested in nature. And the other one is the Tetragrammaton, referred to as Havaya, the God of existence. This is the transcendent aspect of God, where God transcends time and space. And Pharaoh was quite comfortable with the notion that God is the God of nature. Even atheists have some spiritual attachment to nature. They feel that nature is awesome and divine in some way. Spinoza equated God with nature. So Pharaoh's saying, if you tell me God is a natural force, look, we have many such natural forces and gods that are named after them. I'll invite you to add this to the telephone book. Just give me his address and telephone number and email, of course, and that will be fine. But as soon as Moses tells him that there's a God who transcends nature, who's not a captive of nature, who didn't create nature and is bound by his own creation, and that we can't manipulate that God. God manipulates us, which runs contrary to paganism, which creates God in their image. God created us in his image. Pagans create God in their image. So if their image changes, if they feel different one day, they change their gods. So that's what Pharaoh was saying. I don't know this concept of God that you're telling me about, a God that transcends nature. Oh, you can do magic tricks? We can also do magic tricks. I'm not impressed, Pharaoh said. When Moses demonstrated how the staff turned into a snake and the staff swallowed up the snakes of Pharaoh's magicians, it was a miracle, but he wasn't impressed, and wasn't impressed with many of the other miracles. Why? Because magic, the way they understood it, was a manipulation of nature. That nature itself has this ability to be manipulated by certain people who were trained in that art of sorcery and magic. So he was not impressed at all with Moses' demand. And part of it, of course, was God said that I'm going to harden his heart. That even when he starts to have some doubts about his own idea of everything, of existence and of God, and of his role as the one who enslaved the Jewish people, even when he started to have doubts, God made sure that his heart would be hardened. Now, Moses, what does Moses ask? This is one of the most puzzling parts of the story. What does Moses ask Pharaoh? What is he specifically asking for?
3-day trip.
A 3-day trip to Disneyland. Okay, it wasn't Disneyland. It was a desert gathering, celebration. Why didn't he tell the truth? That he was demanding that Pharaoh let the Jewish people go and be totally free. He didn't ask them to be free. He asked them for a 3-day vacation. He never said, and then they'll come back. So he didn't lie. Yes, they did spend 3 days plus more days. There was no actual lie, but still he misled Pharaoh. And he should have demanded everything. So the simple answer to this question is, that Moses was trying to demonstrate how evil Pharaoh was. Why did Pharaoh enslave the Jews? One can make an argument that it was an economic decision. Slavery is good for the economy, Pharaoh may have argued. You have a whole workforce that just builds all the cities for you. That's wonderful for the Egyptian economy. If someone really cares about slavery, wants slavery because of the economy, then they would want their slaves to have some respite, to have some rest. They would want the slaves to be able to rejuvenate themselves and be stronger when they come back. So by him not even allowing the Jews to go for 3 days demonstrated that he didn't care for the well-being of the slaves, which would translate into more success for Egyptian culture and the economy of Egypt. Yes?
Yeah. What I mentioned before about you have not let my firstborn son go. God also said to Moses to tell Pharaoh that I will kill your firstborn son. Why? Moses did not do that. Why?
Moses didn't do what?
God said to tell him, I'm going to kill your firstborn son, but Moses never said that to Pharaoh.
But we don't know everything Moses said. The Torah doesn't always tell you. If God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh something, we assume that he told him. Sometimes the Torah tells you more details of what he communicated, and sometimes it tells you less. But he certainly told him what he was told to tell him. So here, Moses is trying to show that Pharaoh had no interest really in his own economy, his own country. He just wanted to torture Jews. And this is very much relevant today, what's going on. None of the people who protest, except for maybe the Jews, the Jews are the only fools who really believe in these ideologies, like communism, but the people who are protesting what they say is being done to the people in Gaza, they don't care about the people in Gaza. It's just because they want to blame Israel and the Jewish people. That's all it is. It's not, there's no altruism, there's no idealism, there's no sincerity over there. It's just sincere anti-Israel sentiment. Because if they really cared about the people in Gaza, they would have pressured Hamas and pressured the Arabs to not allow them to do what they're doing. They wouldn't have allowed billions of dollars to go into Gaza to build terror tunnels and all the things that they did instead of building up their economy. It wasn't the economy, it was Israel. And that's exactly what happened with Pharaoh. Moses tried to show, I'm only asking for 3 days. Let them have a little vacation and they'll rejuvenate themselves. They'll come back refreshed and Egypt will prosper. No, I'm not going to even allow that. So Moses does what he was told by God. He successfully approaches Pharaoh, but unsuccessfully convinces him of anything. Not only did he not convince Pharaoh to let the people go and to free them from slavery, the slavery becomes even more harsh. To make bricks, you have to put straw in the bricks, in the mortar, and instead of being provided with straw, they're going to have to find the straw themselves, and the quota of bricks will not be diminished. That's what it says in the Torah, that now the slavery became worse. And who was targeted? If you didn't bring in the quota of bricks, who was beaten? What? No, Moses wasn't beaten. Which Jews were beaten? The foremen, the people in charge. The way the slavery was done, the way the Nazis did it, you delegated the responsibility to beat the victims, the slaves, if they don't produce what they're supposed to produce. So these foremen were supposed to beat the Jews to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do, and they didn't. These foremen, unlike the capos, many of them, I can't say for all of them, who were commissioned by the Germans to control the Jews and beat them and punish them, and they did it. These 4 men allowed themselves to be beaten, and that's why later on they were chosen to be the leaders, the judges of the Jewish people when the Jews were in the desert, because they refused to torture their own brethren. That's one of the praises that are given. And they became, later on, some of the judges of the people. But now the people were turning against Moses and Aaron. People are turning against them. First, when Moses approaches the people, it says the people believed. Vayamein ha'am, and the nation believed that they are going to be delivered now. And here, this messenger of God, Moses and Aaron, promised them redemption. And not only do things not get better, you can imagine when Moses walks into the palace and people were watching this, they were in 7th heaven. Wow, we're going to be liberated. This is incredible. And Moses comes out and the things get worse for them. So people were really upset with Moses. And Moses was upset. And Moses complains to God. Now, the question is, why did God do this? God promised him that he will succeed. So why does God allow Moses to do what he's supposed to do and fail miserably? What's going on over here? Why is God playing games with us?
He wants us to recognize how great he is when he finally does rescue us.
But why does he the Jews went through hundreds of years of slavery and torture, and finally God sends them the messenger to liberate them, and he is the messenger sent by God, so he has to be successful. And God allows him to fail, and only later to be successful, but not initially. Because there are 2 tests of faith. When people are suffering, and they have faith they're going to be liberated from the suffering, that's a test, to have faith in the face of suffering and pain. But there's a greater test of faith when after the suffering, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Oh, it's getting light, things are going to get better. And all of a sudden, you go into another tunnel, even darker than the first tunnel. That causes disillusionment. Jews have gone through the worst of conditions in history, but they didn't lose their faith. But as soon as things get better and they get worse again, they revert to the original darkness. That's even a greater test. And it's interesting, in the book of Daniel, that's a biblical book where it talks about the coming of Mashiach. It refers to the people who didn't lose faith. Fortunate are those who wait. And Rashi, the commentator, as well as the Midrash earlier, speak about how Mashiach's coming will come by Mashiach revealing himself and then his being concealed. And who is the one who is really praised and considered to be fortunate? It's the person who doesn't lose faith in the second phase. Before Mashiach comes, everyone waits for Mashiach, but Mashiach finally announces himself, and he's present, and all of a sudden things get worse. He conceals himself. That's the test. That's the ultimate test. And that's what happened over here. Moses comes initially. He has good news, and everyone is excited, and their faith pays off, it seems, and all of a sudden their hopes are dashed. And Moses feels the pain, and he complains to God. Now, how could Moses complain? Moses was the greatest human being that ever lived. Moses was the holiest person to ever walk on this earth. No other human being was as close to God as Moses. The most righteous person, bar none. Nobody could compare to Moses. Moses was so great that for hundreds of years, no child was ever named Moses. Why? Because it was trepidation. I'm going to call my child and insinuate somehow that my child is like Moses in any way. How could anyone get even close to Moses? And we can go on and on extolling the virtues of Moses. And yet Moses, when things don't go the right way, he complains to God. Why? He's complaining to God. Why was he complaining? And didn't he know that God himself told him that Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened? So here this was happening. So the way to understand it is to point to the fact that a person who complains to God when other people are suffering is not a vice, it's a virtue. When you see someone suffering and you complain to God, it shows two things. Number one, that you have a deep belief in God. You don't complain to someone that you don't believe in exists. If someone needs something and you don't believe that there's someone who can help you, you're not going to complain, because who are you complaining to? The source of your help doesn't exist in your mind. If you don't believe in God, if someone is an atheist, I don't want to say if you're an atheist, but if someone is claims to be an atheist, they have no right to complain when things don't go right. They have no intellectual right. It's a free country, so they can do whatever they want, but it doesn't make any sense for them. There's no rhyme or reason for anything. Existence is just an accident. So if it's an accident, why are you complaining? If you complain, it's proof that you really have a profound faith that there is a cause, there is a source that can help, and you're upset that that source did not help. So that's a sign that you really believe. And a lot of Holocaust survivors, I discovered, who claimed that they lost their faith, didn't lose their faith. They were upset. They were upset at God for what happened. And that shows that they never lost their faith. And that, I think, is borne out by statistically. I shared this many times, that I once taught a course at UB. Over the years, they had to write a term paper, an interview with Holocaust survivors. And the interview had to consist of 3 parts. Part 1 was, what was their level of faith and Jewish practice before the Holocaust? Part 2, what was their level of faith and practice during the Holocaust? And part 3, what is the status of their faith and their observance now, post-Holocaust? I was expecting to get 70, 80% of people saying, or more, they lost their faith and they don't have faith because of what happened. Instead, I had about 200 interviews over the years. 198 were all about how they had faith. Many didn't lose it. Many got their faith stronger after the Holocaust. But the majority of people answered that they may have lost their faith, but they got it back after the Holocaust. Some say not as much as before. The level of observance is not as much. But there were only 2, if I remember correctly, maybe 3, who said that they lost their faith and they still do not have any faith. That was totally the opposite of what I expected. Because most of the people who may have said that they don't believe, that was just their way of complaining to God. And that's what Moses was doing. Moses was showing his profound faith in God. He didn't have any doubts about God. He knew God is responsible for everything. But the second part is even more important. It shows that you care. If you complain about something, it means you care. If someone does something wrong and it's no big deal and you don't complain, it's because you don't really care about it that much. Why should you? It's not that consequential. But when you really care about something, you're going to complain. You're going to cry out. You're going to respond in some way. So Moses complaining was Moses' way of saying, God, you're in charge of everything. But look what you did. You caused pain to my people. Another aspect of Moses' complaint was not that he was complaining why God did what he did, but his complaint was really more specific. He says, God, I told you I'm not qualified. I told you I'm a disaster ready to happen. Look what happened. I go to Pharaoh, and not only does he not listen to me, which shows that he doesn't have respect for me, but he made things even worse. So Moses was trying to confirm with God that his arguments why he should not be sent were valid arguments. But yet God is upset with Moses. According to Rashi, God complains to Moses. He says, "You're not like the patriarchs. They didn't ask questions." So why did Moses ask questions and the patriarchs didn't ask? So the Rebbe explains that Moses was right and God was right. Moses was right for asking God, why did you do this? Because Moses personified the ultimate level of understanding, of intellectual grasping of an idea. Moses was the messenger through which the Torah would be given. If you give a mission to an intellectual, if you're God especially, and you know what you're doing, you expect the intellectual to use his brain. If you're giving a mission to someone who's not an intellectual, you don't expect them to philosophize about it. You don't expect them to have a deep understanding of it. That's not their strength. It's not their mission. Moses realized that his mission was to understand, and therefore he says, "I want to understand God. I'm not criticizing God. I'm begging for understanding. Why did you allow this to happen?" And then God says to Moses, yes, you are at the level of understanding. You can't just go by faith, but then there's a level that transcends understanding, and I want you to rise to a higher level. So Moses is constantly growing in his own spiritual development. Yes?
So how does this compare to Abraham? When, God says, take Isaac.
Abraham didn't ask any questions.
Right.
Right, that's God's comparison. Abraham didn't ask any questions, but Moses was different. Abraham was a man who personified divine attributes of love, of kindness, not intellect. I'm not saying that he wasn't smart, but that was not his specialty. Moses is the ultimate intellect. There's no human being in the history of the world that was as smart as Moses. Even King Solomon could not compare to Moses. There were things that King Solomon couldn't understand that Moses did understand.
But Abraham did ask God when he wanted to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham did ask, would you, the God of the universe, destroy?
No, that's different. God did not tell Abraham to destroy Sodom. God just told him, I happen to be I'm going to be destroying Sodom. So when Abraham hears that, he understands that God wants him to plead on behalf of the Sodomites. So he does that. But he doesn't ask questions.
That's the question he asked.
No, he doesn't ask questions. Why did you do this? He's just saying that would you let them off if there are so many righteous people? And when God says no, there are no such righteous people, he says, okay, God, what you do is right. I have no questions. But there was a bigger question that Abraham could have asked. God promised Abraham that he would have children and descendants. The only son he had from Isaac. And now he tells Abraham to slaughter Isaac. In his mind, he thought that's what God meant. It didn't make sense. There was a contradiction. He could have asked that question very easily. He didn't ask. It didn't occur to him to ask a question when God tells you to do something. You want me to do it, God? Just tell me where to go and what to do, and I'll do it. How it fits in with everything else didn't occur to him. But it does occur to Moses. Moses has to understand. Moses personifies understanding. But then there's a level that goes beyond this. In other words, there are three levels, essentially. There's a level of basic faith where you just accept what God tells you, and that's the hallmark of simple people, usually. And they're extolled for their virtue of sincerity and simplicity. Then there is a person who's known to be an intellect. They have to understand. That's their mission in life. And then there's the transcending of their intellect. So that's That's the level that Moses was reaching after this incident. In response to Moses' complaint, God says, don't worry, things are going to get better, things are going to change, and I'm going to liberate them. And God uses 4 expressions that describe the idea of liberation. We spoke about this in another class. Why 4 expressions? And by the way, one of the reasons given for drinking 4 cups of wine at the Seder is because there are 4 expressions of freedom. Why 4 expressions? If God is just repeating himself 4 times to give us an excuse to drink 4 cups of wine, why did God have to do it that way? He could have just said, drink 4 cups of wine. But there's 4 different levels of freedom. And that's what the commentators point out. They point it out in different ways, different versions of it, but this is the most logical version. What were Jews subjected to when they were in Egypt? Slavery, of course, but there's 2 kinds of slavery. There's torturous slavery, where the master tortures you and beats you and crushes you and tries to destroy you if you deviate somewhat. That's torture. You don't have to be a slave to be tortured. People can torture other people even if they're not slaves. So the first thing that they were liberated from was the torture. The back-breaking torture they were released from a half year before the Exodus. Rosh Hashanah is the anniversary of when we were no longer tortured as slaves. A half year before the Exodus. The second thing is you could be not tortured, but you can still be a slave. You can have a very benign form of slavery. Your master is very nice to you and gives you all the privileges that you would like, except for freedom. You just belong to that person, which is terrible. That's one of the scourges of slavery, that you don't have your own independent identity. But at least you're not being tortured, you're not being beaten. You know, in the South, when we had slavery, we had 2 kinds of masters. You had the masters that were cruel and sadistic in the way they treated their slaves, and there were masters who were wonderful and treated them wonderfully. So the second liberation was to be liberated from being slaves. Not only were they not being tortured, they were not being slaves at all. But then they were still hostages. They couldn't leave Egypt. And Egypt was not their home. Even though they were there for quite a long time, their home was to be in Israel. So as soon as they were let to go out of Egypt, that was the 3rd level of freedom. So then where's the 4th level of freedom?
I will take you unto me as a family.
I will take you as, right, that's the 4th level. And what is that referring to? That's referring to Mount Sinai, when they got the Torah at Mount Sinai, which was the whole rationale for the Exodus. When Moses complains to God that the people are not worthy, how could I redeem them? They're not material for being free. It's like a prisoner who comes out of a maximum security prison and they go right back in a few days later, a few weeks later, a few years later. Why? Because they were not ready to be liberated. So Moses says these people are not ready to be liberated. They don't have the potential to be free. And God says, don't worry, they will serve God on this mountain. That means that right now they're not ready to be liberated. They're still pretty raw. And that's why God was afraid to take them through the Gaza, because that was too close to Egypt and they might change their minds and go right back into slavery. They'd prefer slavery over having to fight wars with their enemies. So God says, but you know what? They're going to get the Torah. And once they get the Torah, that will give them the strength to be truly free. So the true freedom of the Jewish people came not when they left Egypt. It came when they received the Torah at Mount Sinai. That's why we drink the 4th cup. There's also a fifth cup that we pour because there's a fifth expression, I will take you to the land. That didn't happen in the process of the Exodus. Even though we got the land eventually, we lost the land twice. And miraculously, we have partial control over the land today. Israel is not an independent country in the true sense of the word independent. Unfortunately, Israel's decisions about its own self-defense hinges on what the American government tells it. And it has always been the case, but it's never been more pronounced than it is today, because Israel is not fighting a war tit for tat. It's fighting a war of survival, because they are out to destroy Israel, and that's what we're seeing in America also, the call for the destruction of Israel. And if you ask them, you mean if you destroy Israel, there are 7 million Jews living there, what happens to them? So either they won't answer because they know their answer is going to get them into trouble, or they'll tell the truth, what they really believe. Get rid of them, or let them go back to Poland. So that's why the fifth cup, we don't drink the fifth cup, because we're not yet fully entrenched in our land. When Mashiach comes, Israel will be our land. We will be totally independent. We'll not have to rely on what other governments tell it. And there's a certain extent, Israel has to listen to America, because America supplies it with weapons. If America stops supplying Israel with weapons, Israel doesn't have the capacity to defend itself endlessly. I mean, the enemies could just keep on shooting rockets. The miracle is that Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets, they say, and has only shot a few hundred, maybe a few thousand. If they would shoot 150,000 within a few days, that would wreak havoc on Israel. Maybe they're afraid because Israel might use an atom bomb. That's the deterrence. That's why Israel, it's a good thing that he has the atom bomb. The more the better. Israel needs to have a deterrent, but it's still, for its day-to-day existence, it depends to a great extent on what other countries in the world tell it. So that's the story of the 4 levels of redemption, and that God tells Moses to tell the people, and the people didn't want to listen because of the shortness of breath, because of the life was becoming much more difficult for them. And Moses took that personally. Moses felt that if I can't get through to my own people, how am I going to get through to Pharaoh? And the question is asked, well, there's a big difference. Pharaoh wasn't a slave. He didn't have shortness of breath. But Moses said, if I can't get through to my own people, that means I'm not a real leader. I'm not really their leader. Because a leader's status is defined by the people that the person who leads. If the people are incapable of being free, spiritually free, if they're incapable of believing, then that means that the leader is deficient. And Moses was therefore saying, if I'm not a good leader of my own people, how could I get a Pharaoh, who is our enemy, to agree to me? I can't even reach my own nation. And of course, God's response to that is that you're not going on your own, I'm going with you. In the Haggadah, we say that God didn't send any messengers. He did it all by himself. Well, the question is, Moses was a messenger. And the answer is, Moses was a messenger, but he was just going along with God. It's like someone takes you on a trip to do something, and they just let you sit in the car while they're driving there. Technically, they're going with you, but they're not really doing anything. They are just sitting along your side, and someone else is doing everything. God did everything in this Exodus. Moses was just God's sidekick, as it was, and therefore we could easily say that God did it without any messenger. He didn't send any angels. He didn't send any messengers. God did it exclusively. And that's how it worked, because God was the one who did it. Any questions? Okay. Any questions on the Zoom?
So, God participate now. What happened in war or not?
What happened? What?
What now happened?
What's going to happen now?
Yes.
You want me to answer with
He
my
washed hand.
what?
Or he washed hand and look.
No. God doesn't ever do that. That's the Jewish God is totally involved in everything. Sometimes we like what he does. Sometimes we don't like what he does. Sometimes we understand what he's doing. Sometimes we don't understand. Is there a silver lining in what's going on? I think Jews are maybe beginning to wake up a little about the anti-Semitism, and that means that they have to be more Jewish. You can't escape being Jewish. Now, there are Jews who are fighting for the other side. If the other side ever gets power, they'll be the first ones to be slaughtered. The communist Jews were the ones really serious about communism, the obsektia, and they were slaughtered by Stalin. Stalin had no more use for them, even though they were the best communists, because it's not about communism, the ideology, it's about power. And if you see someone else having power, you don't care if they agree with you or not, you destroy them. That's how it has been throughout history.
So for human, regular human, it's good to be chosen or not?
Is it good? A German soldier, SS, was about to shoot a Jew. And the Jew said, "Can I make a blessing before you kill me?" And he didn't care, it would be amusing. And the blessing the Jew said was, "Thank you, God, that you haven't made me a German."
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
So what is the third level, the one which goes above intellectual?
The third level is where you do understand, but you recognize that God is beyond your understanding. That as soon as you begin to understand, you recognize there's a higher level, there's something beyond that. You see, Maimonides, when he lists the 613 commandments, he lists the first commandment is to know God. And the question is asked, the way it's understood is to believe in God. The question is asked, you can't command someone to believe in something, because if they believe in you as the commander, they already believe. If they don't believe in God, then they're not going to be, God says, the God that you don't believe in says you must believe in him. It doesn't work. So there are two different answers. One is that Maimonides doesn't use the word belief, he uses the word know. That it's not enough to believe in God, you have to know to the extent that a human being is capable of understanding God. You have an obligation to use your mind. That you can order a person who already believes. He said, you believe in God? Great. Now God wants you not just to rely on belief, but to go to the second level. The second level is knowing, das, as the Hebrew word. But then there's another approach that says that's still not enough. The next level, the commandment is that you believe in God and you have a certain amount of knowledge of God, but you have to believe that God is beyond what you could understand. Whatever you understand, however sophisticated, you have to know God is beyond that. So if you're on this level of a sophistication, you know God is beyond that. If you're at this level, God is beyond that. Whatever level you understand, you know that God is beyond that.
Okay. It's horizon.
back to the level one. So it's
Right.
back to level one, right?
Level 1 is the basic level that you believe in God's existence. And it's actually, you don't even need belief that God exists, because it's absolutely asinine, it's ludicrous, it's idiotic to believe that the world happened by itself. You know, I know there are scientists who claim to be atheists, but they're fools. And the word fool associated with people who say there is no God is used in the book of Psalms. And Aristotle, I think, also uses it in his text. Even though Aristotle's notion of God is not the Jewish notion of God, but still the idea that the world has no creator, has no master, things happen by themselves is foolish. You know, there's a famous story in the Talmud of the emperor in Rome was debating God with a rabbi, I think it was Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua, the king excuses himself. He wasn't convinced by his arguments, and there was an inkwell on the table. So the rabbi takes out some ink and draws a beautiful picture. He was an artist. When the king comes back, he said, "Who did this?" And the rabbi says, "Oh, it was an accident. By accident, I knocked over the inkwell, and it formed this picture." He says, "That's crazy. Nothing can happen by itself. Nothing can be formed by itself." It's a cute little story, but it happens to be very true. You don't need sophisticated philosophical arguments to prove God's existence. Just use common sense, which is not common.